Well, there are certainly things that have followed on from the fact that what should we say? The woke, the awakened, do not see themselves as Christian, see themselves as having emancipated themselves from Christianity, because there are certain impulses, I think, within human nature that Christianity has served to kind of bit and bridle, and one of them actually is the category of original sin, which I think ties into what you were alluding to. Original sin is absolutely the category that people in the 60s, who came to reject Christianity really hated. It was everything the hippies were not about. The idea that we're all infected by sin because Adam and Eve fell, absolute no. And so it came to seem, in the tune of the 60s spirit, progressive spirit, that we're all born free. We're not born with original sin, and that seems, who wouldn't want to sign up to that? But I think that we now see the implications of that, because it turns out that original sin is a very democratic doctrine, because it means that we're all sinners. We've all got fault. And one of the issues, I think, with what's happening is that there are large numbers of people who don't feel that they're sinners, who feel that they're liberated. And ultimately, this goes back to, and you see, this is why I love ancient history. It goes back to the 5th century AD. Of course it does. And it goes back to an argument between two theologians, Pelagius, who was this great burly Briton, the very first British intellectual that we know of, who argued that it was possible for Christians to become perfect through their own agency. So you could, if you're sufficiently virtuous, you can attain heaven through your own agency. And against this, you have Augustine, this kind of glowering, brilliant North African bishop, who says, no, we are all saturated in sin. We're steeped in sin. We cannot get to heaven through our own agency. We depend on the grace of God because we're all sinners. And it's Augustine's doctrine that wins out. Pelagius becomes a heretic. And the 60s is a Pelagian movement, because it's saying, no, we can become perfect. This is the age of Aquarius. We can become virtuous through our own agency. And I think that the Great Awakening is a Pelagian movement. It feels that it is possible for people to become virtuous and to become perfect. But the problem with that is that if you are convinced of your own virtue, if you're convinced of your own rectitude, and you are convinced that it is possible to become perfect, then that means that you are in a position to sit in moral judgment on those who haven't. And I think that is what that's what a lot of people who find a certain quality of moral self-satisfaction in the awakened, I think that's what they feel, and I think that what they're feeling, what they're reacting to, is the Pelagian quality of it. They're Augustinian without knowing it.
Well, the other problem, of course, and you make a great point, the other problem, of course, with that mindset is that anyone who has failed to become perfect is therefore not ordinarily human, but actually is morally deficient in some way.
Yes,
so that's
absolutely.
Another factor. But look, Francis and I have expressed a lot of concerns about what we've described here as the woke movement. Woke people might say that being described as woke is a sort of slanderous term, that it's inappropriately applied. And I wanted to put the counterpoint, playing devil's advocate somewhat. You've charted the historical context of all of this, all the way from the papacy in the 11th century, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on. These are all, great strides in human history. Even the French Revolution, massive bloodbath, does end feudalism, and we move into a sort of new world that we're all happy to live in. So are me, Francis, and everyone else who sort of opposes the woke stuff, are we these crusty old, minor nobles in pre-revolutionary France who are sort of about to witness our own demise, and that's why we hate it?
Well,
is that where we are?
I mean, lurking behind this is the idea that of progress. and moral progress, so progressivism. And people very rarely stop to think, well, why do we have this idea? Why do we assume that there's some kind of moral arc that's going forwards? And it's very hardwired.
Well, because of I would say, and you'll correct me, no doubt, very shortly, but I would say it's because as we look into the last millennium, that's what we've seen. As we look into the last two millennia, broadly speaking, that's what we've seen.
But I mean, we can talk about technical progress, but the idea of moral progress, where does that come from? Why do we now think that, say, slavery is wrong or whatever? And again, it's fundamentally comes down to Christian theology. And this is the weird thing that I really didn't begin with any particular interest in Christianity. I had no particular interest in theology. And the kind of dawning realization, looking at the classical world, the pre-Christian world, contemplating how different it was, how strange, how many assumptions they had that seemed totally alien to me. And I said, where do these ideas come from? And always, it's kind of like, trying to find an itch on your back, and then you get to it and you scratch it. It's so good. That's kind of what it's like, is that strange theological ideas that cropped up, centuries, often millennia ago, continue to reverberate through. It's like, I think it was at Keynes who said that people who think they've got radical new ideas are always in hock to some defunct economist. Well, our society, we're in hock to some defunct theologian invariably. And the idea of progress lies in the notion that is basically goes all the way back to Paul, that there is a law of God. And for the Jews, the law of God is written, on the tablets that got given to Moses, that in turn got given to the children of Israel. Paul says, no, actually the law of God is written on the heart. And how do we know what that law of God is? Well, the Spirit illumines it and enables us to read it. And the further corollary of that is that the more we read it, the better we become at understanding what it is. And in turn, unlike, say, Islam, which inherits from the Jews the idea that you have a mass body of law that comes directly from God and therefore kind of is eternally extant, Christians have always thought that the law is illumined by the Spirit, therefore humans can legitimately author that, and law itself will become progressive because over the course of time, human understanding of what God's law is will become better and better and better.
The rules can change.
Yeah, and improve is the point.
Yeah, exactly.
Improve is the point.
Yes.
So slavery is the obvious example. So people always say, well, why did it take so long for Christians to decide to get rid of slavery, that slavery was wrong? I mean, Christians always thought slavery was wrong. But in the same way that they thought kind of disease or poverty was wrong. But they just kind of assumed that it was part of what it is to be mortal. It's part of the inheritance of the fall. But what happened in the 18th century was that, again, we talked about these very distinctive Protestant understanding of the Spirit, which is that you read the text of Scripture, the Spirit illumines you, and your understanding of what is written there will transcend the kind of the base meaning. So the Bible nowhere says get rid of slavery. It nowhere says slavery is as an institution should be abolished. But Christians from that Protestant tradition read the Scriptures and came to the conclusion that slavery was evil. And they did that chiefly because they were living in societies that had pushed the institution of slavery to a kind of hideously mechanized degree. So you could put up with, slavery where it was 2 or 3 people, in a village or something. But where you've got institutionalized mass torture and transportation, the horror of it began to percolate through and to stimulate the consciences of people who were witnessing it. And furthermore, on top of that, it became racialized because slavery previously hadn't been racialized. There were lots of white slaves in the early days of the colonies in America, but increasingly, because slaves came to be exclusively from African, that also served to unsettle the consciences of white Christians because they knew that they tried to kind of manufacture reasons why Africans should be enslaved and Europeans should be the masters, but they couldn't really do it. And so the strain of that ultimately enabled first Quakers and then evangelicals to convince themselves that God was against slavery. And then having done that, to agitate and push for its abolition. And the abolitionist movement really is the model for every socially concerned progressive movement that has followed since. It kind of, in 1814, mass agitation across Britain forced the Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, at the Congress of Vienna after the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, to go there. And even though he didn't want to do it, it was kind of like Theresa May having to go and argue for Brexit. Even though she didn't want to do it, she had to. Same way Castlereagh had to, because he had this mass agitation going on behind him in London and across the country, to go and ask all the other powers, we've got to get rid of slavery. You've got to sign up to it. That's kind of the model. And which of us would want to live in a world where slavery was morally acceptable? So, but at the same time, there is a kind of temptation, I suppose, where you can end up being in love with your own feeling of virtue. And that is also, that's a temptation, I think, that people who are pushing progressive causes always have to be alert to. And that's something that Christians historically have always been aware. They've always contemplated that they might be sinners themselves, that to be overly convinced of your own virtue is in itself, to cease to be virtuous. And I think that the collapse of doctrinal Christianity, the retreat of overt belief, the collapse of doctrines like original sin, have kind of bred perhaps a degree of moral overconfidence on the part of people who feel that they are furthering progressive causes.